It's working.
I would have definitely read that as doors open at 6. Christine, do you think we should give it a little bit more?
Do you want to maybe give it like 10 minutes at least, 5 minutes?
Jess will send me up.
Just, I think, well, I would
people will
certainly
be
have read it
arriving.
as
Yeah.
doors open at 6.
Yeah.
Are you happy to start 5 minutes later?
Yeah, I'm
I'll tell
happy.
Jess.
Sure.
Yeah, she will, yeah.
I'll tell her.
Is she already live streaming?
Well, that's the question, I think.
Yeah, because some people are still arriving.
This is a disaster, this water.
As long as you haven't poured it all over your phone. As long as you haven't poured it all over your phone.
No.
We are streaming.
Indestructible Fairphone.
Yes, it's streaming.
You can just tell Jess when it starts.
Okay.
I think.
That's fine.
You're not recording, are you? But, yeah, it's not interfering.
Not in the room, no, through the magic of hidden into
The magic of
behind
yeah,
the table,
I was
through the pipes.
Through the pipes, yeah. Okay, good.
In the
Good.
Yeah, I wouldn't jeopardise it.
Yeah.
So, give it a few minutes.
We're giving it another few minutes for, in case people thought 6 o'clock was doors opening at 6, like we are a live gig or something, you know.
I need the warm-up music.
Warm-up music, yeah. Please.
We had our band at the event yesterday. You know, some of the students are in a band and they play AI-generated music.
Oh,
That's cool. Very,
Yeah,
very, very
that's cool.
good. Very good. Really
That's cool.
good.
I remember sitting on an A-Live, at an A-Live conference on a kind of generative music event. It was super cool.
Yeah, I would read
Yeah, I mean, blown away by how good they were actually.
Yeah.
Interesting. Because the artwork isn't necessarily there yet, is it?
Oh, cool.
I quite like some, I don't know, I quite like playing around with it, but yeah, this was
It's funny because years ago, before the AI craze, it was called generative music and generative art, and now it's become AI music and AI art. Just like, okay.
Thank you.
And we're just waiting a few minutes because ambiguity around so much time.
Yes.
Isn't this bit where you sing this song?
There is Sophie. Sophie? Sorry, I'm just like, you're one of the others.
Zoe.
Zoe, not Sophie. Sophie's not there. Zoe, there is
Zoe,
Eva.
Ava, yeah.
Yeah.
Sitting next to Ava is Jan.
Jane was one of the experts for policing.
Prescient. Prescient is
Present, yes.
third row.
Where?
Third row in the middle.
Yes, third row in the middle. Okay, is Present. And yeah, and I didn't know him.
There's me and Ben.
There is. there is.
So this is the first time that we've met.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
In person.
Did we meet online? Did you come in on that first Zoom?
Oh yeah, oh absolutely, I was
I
there
think so,
online. Yeah, but no, yeah, it's the first.
Proper.
Yeah, this doesn't count as meeting, doesn't it?
Yeah, one more minute and I'm going
Yeah.
live.
Do you want me to get Jess ready
There's a good
to
Cybersalon
be ready?
back at the pavilion.
Shall I tell Jess?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I can go? Yes, I'm going to go. And I'm going to start with housekeeping because that's always the loveliest part of the event. So in case there is a sound alarm coming off, it's not an exercise, it's a real problem. So There is no meeting point specific, just the idea is to get out of the building as soon as you can. Okay, that's a bit vague, but okay. If some of you want to go to the toilets, okay, and not get lost, you go on the right after the door, go down the stairs to the main atrium, and the easiest ones to find are in the right corridor. There is a gender-neutral toilet slightly on the right. That's it for housekeeping. Okay, so hello and welcome to all of you in the room and to all the people online that may be watching us right now. This event is the King's College London stop of a wider book tour, a book that came out a couple of months ago entitled All Tomorrow's Futures, Fictions That Disrupt, and there are some copies for sale at the end. And the reason for having a special event as part of the book tour here at King's College London is that 4 of King's academics participated in the book project, 3 of which are present tonight. So Claire Steeves, Professor of Aging and Health and Head of the Department of Twin Research and Genetic Epidemiology. Elizabeth Black, who's a reader in Artificial Intelligence in the Department of Informatics and also the director of the UKRI Center for Doctoral Training in Safe and Trusted Artificial Intelligence. There is also another of our colleagues who unfortunately couldn't make it tonight, Gabrielle Samuel, who's lecturer in Environmental Justice and Health in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, and who is also a co-director of a research group and network called SHADE, which is an acronym describing the intersection of sustainability, health, AI, digital technologies, and the environment. And the last one is me, Christine Aicardi, who is a senior research fellow in science and technology studies and also a responsible research and innovation lead for 2 centers for doctoral training, the one of which Liz is director, so she's my boss, in short. And the other one is the EPSRC Center for Smart Medical Imaging. So the reason this event is organized by the King's Institute for Artificial Intelligence is that the topic that brought together the books project in the first place is about speculating about possible futures, about 30 years from now, that would explore potential consequences of societal evolution, of scientific progress, and of technological developments, of which AI and data science are a big part because they are ubiquitous of a lot of the technologies being deployed and worked on now and for the foreseeable future. So a big thank you to the King's AI Institute and to Carly and Jess who've been organizing this for us, and also to the AV team who are currently busy behind their screens and mics and everything. So we are also joined, I'm not going to forget them, by the two editors of the book. So Ben Greenaway and Stephen Oram at the far side of me. Stephen being also a full-time author. I will add now that the think tank Cybersalon is behind the book project and also is the publisher of the book. And this is where I'm going to hand over to Ben as we start on the first theme of the discussion, which is why this project and why this book in the first place. So Ben, if you can introduce yourself and Cybersalon, what it is, how long it's been running, who's founded it, etc.
Okay, will do. Thank you. Thank you, Christine. Hello, Kings and audience. So Cybersalon is a digital think tank. It was founded in 1997. Our founder is actually here. It's one of the writers of the book, Eva Pascoe. Founded in London in 97. primarily to chart the digital transformations that were taking place in our burgeoning online world. So that was the time our web was available, it was working, commerce was starting to play with the web, investors were playing with the web, Cybersalon, Siberia cafes were cropping up all over London and the rest of the world, and there was a lot of activity. But what there wasn't so much was a place to sit down and talk about the policy, to talk about the cultural impacts that this thing might bring about, the changes and the transitions that were going to happen there. And Cybersalon was founded to create a space for that. It was in the Siberia Cafe at the time. I think I'm right in saying that's right. Yep. And our current membership is somewhere in the hundreds. It could be practitioners right now of those technologies. So as we're hearing, everything from AI, data storage, e-commerce, privacy concerns, commerce concerns, startups, established businesses, bringing established businesses online, the classic digital transformation, so on and so forth. We are also members are artists, educators, academics, as well as industry professionals. So a big mixing pot, meeting semi-regularly throughout London, obviously less so during COVID, but that'll be one of the backstories to the book. And part of Cybersalon's work has always been to run public events and to do public engagement discussion in these technologies, for which the book sort of came around. Do you want any more for now, or is that good enough tease?
Yeah, because my follow-up question is why would Cybersalon want to do this as a project, as culminating in a book, and want to do this, what for, and how did you choose the themes that went into it, and so on?
Okay, that's a lot.
At which you're probably going to hand over to
Yeah,
Steve
we've pricked a few
complement.
of these pieces apart. Yeah, so, okay, so probably worth telling the history story, the how we got there part, okay, which takes us back to really the COVID and the book that isn't this book. I'll keep mentioning this book. So that first year, we knew Cybersalon wasn't really going to be doing very much in the way of meetups. There were no public events going on. Stephen and I had known each other for a couple of years at that point. You two had just done a project on applied science fiction elsewhere that you were thinking of wondering, how do I do these kind of projects? And I'm sure you'll talk about applied science fiction. But how do we do conversations between practitioners and storytellers and story writers? And we thought, actually, lockdown's going to be a really good time to try and do that with the Cybersalon memberships. So Stephen and I sort of got our heads together and thought about commissioning stories to read in a small Zoom call as a start of what was going to be an online event rather than a real-world event that year. And we ended up doing 4 of them across the year, at the end of which we were like, well, that was fun. They were very focused short stories. They had to be read out in under 5 minutes. And we had to read 4 of them in one Zoom call, so it was getting pretty punchy. But at the end of that process, which made lockdown much more fun and gave us something to do, a lot of the Cybersalon membership said, we really like this process. It allowed us to ask questions about subject matter that we might not normally have talked about. And could we get involved with the storytellers earlier on in the project? We don't just want to read a story that you've commissioned. We want to get involved in exploring it through the story. So we full-heartedly said, that sounds like fun, let's do that. And that was really what kicked off writing a book. And it did change. It's no longer running live events. It was the goal was, okay, we're going to go through that process. What does it mean to engage domain practitioners with storytellers? How will we satisfy that request from the membership? And so we sat along, started doing the thinking about it, I guess. I'll pass over to you.
Yeah, Stephen, if you can introduce yourself and riff on from there.
Okay, so Stephen Oram, as Christine said, I write near future speculative fiction. But what I also do a lot of is, it's got lots of different terms, but the term I tend to use is applied science fiction. And just very briefly, what that is in general is, if you imagine the kind of life of an individual context on that and making of that story what they're making of it. The applied bit comes in when you involve experts in whatever it is, and in this one, you know, we've got police and justice, we've got learning and education, we've got health, we've got money, and we've got power and energy. So this one has experts from those areas, but by getting those experts involved in the thinking of the story, the world building is fairly obvious if they're experts, but also what is the story? Working through the plausibility on one side and the entertainment value on the other side. So they're involved there, but then also getting them involved in the telling. So in this case, there's each section had two experts, and both experts have written a commentary on the ideas in the story, having spent 18 months to 2 years talking through ideas, iterating stuff across the whole book. So that's the applied bit, is you're bringing in some sort of expertise and writers, and you get these kind of grounded, plausible.
That's
How's
good for
that?
now. That's good.
Good.
So among the experts who enrolled were some of my colleagues academics at King's. Claire, if you could introduce yourself and tell us why did you agree to be involved?
Hello everybody, my name is Claire Steeves and I'm a professor of ageing and health, but I'm also a geriatrician, so a doctor that looks after older people. So I've just mainly why I got involved in this book is because of our relationship before Stephen, and actually you, Christine, as well, who you introduced me to Stephen a while back because you were doing some projects where you wanted to meet scientists, and you came along to our department and had a chat to some of our data scientists, but also talked to me about some of our ideas around how we might be thinking about how to change people's futures in terms of health span. So then I was not just thinking about lifespan of individuals, but how we can stay healthy for more of our life. And how we might be able to sort of use methods to predict, what the future might hold for a person and what they could do to shift that future to be more healthful. And so we talked about that, and we talked about our use of twins with that, and you wrote a really fantastic story, which I loved it because it really brought out humanity in individuals and the relationship between our compassion and humanity for each other and some of the science, which in that case was a bit dystopian,
Yeah, it probably was, but the humans win out.
Yeah, that's right. So and so I guess that really echoed with me in terms of my clinical sense of what we're trying to do as human beings on this planet, and also the sort of like the impact of the science made me think about the science. So when you approached me again, of course, it's a great opportunity then to sort of re-engage a little bit around that with different people's ideas about how what the future might hold, start to challenge myself, also challenge myself with the other scientists that was involved in the discussions, because I think it's always good to, step out of your comfort zone a bit, and then you can learn. So I definitely did. Thank you.
And Liz, same question.
So I'm Liz Black. As Christine said, I'm a reader in AI at King's. So my main focus of research is computational argumentation. So this is really about giving AI the kind of capability to reason with arguments in the same kind of way that we do as humans. I particularly look at how we can support kind of distributed argumentative reasoning, so where you've got kind of multiple participants exchanging arguments, building arguments together, making joint decisions with arguments, where they might be AI, they might be humans, or they might be humans and AI. So the hope is that we can kind of use this approach to support kind of human and AI's reasoning together, making joint decisions, also that humans can challenge and question the decisions that AI are making. And also I'm director of our Centre for Doctoral Training in Safe and Trusted AI. So this is a joint partnership between King's and Imperial. We train PhD students to be able to, in the kind of responsible development of AI that is safe and trustworthy. And I guess there are a few reasons I agreed to be part of this book. And firstly, because I thought it would be fun and enjoyable, and it definitely was. But also because I think it's really important, kind of as Claire was saying, to really kind of expose yourself to different perspectives and different, to hear more about what what everybody else is thinking about around the future of technology, the future of AI, what people are hopeful for, what they're worried about. And, you know, this is so important to help shape what we do so that the things we're working on, the things we develop that are going to impact society, so that this is really kind of shaped by the needs and the values of society. And then also because I think it's really important to kind of engage the wider public more in these kind of, you know, thinking about these things. So, you know, AI is progressing incredibly quickly. It's the take-up of AI as well. You know, we're seeing massive take-up by industry, by government, by the public. And, you know, it's changing things. It's changing the way we do things, the way we work, the way we engage with culture, the information we get exposed to. And a lot of this is being driven by the big tech companies, right, that have big resource, have, you know, an agenda around these things. And so I think it's really important that all of us get to kind of input into the way this is going. And I think this is a really great way, you know, through these stories, through engaging people in this way, is a really good way of getting people to think about these issues and hopefully then go on to try and kind of shape the discussions around where we're heading.
Thank you. So, I'm going to introduce myself last. So, Claire was an expert on the thematic of health, and Liz was an expert on the thematic of learning and education. I was not an expert on any of the themes of the book. I wrote the postface of the book, reflecting on foresight and applied science fiction. And this comes from the fact that, like I said, I do responsible research and innovation. I teach it. I also have been working for the past a good 12 years now, trying to deploy it in various scientific projects and with different brands of scientists. And already 8 years ago, I met Stephen at an event, serendipitously organized by Luke, actually, he was there. And it was an encounter between me, who was desperately trying to devise ways of doing foresight and anticipate the possible implications of future and emerging technologies in a more participatory way than the traditional public engagement that I was asked to do in the project I was embedded in at the time. And Stephen was a science fiction writer who wanted to meet a lot more scientists and technologists and get into the labs and talk to them. And so say, yeah, let's do things together. And so for the past 8 years, we have been working on many projects together. And yes, for me, what this book does and is part of all this attempt at trying to imagine plausible futures around new technologies, future and emerging technologies, in a way that brings other voices than the traditional voices to be heard. And I do realize that even we try really hard to bring as many voices as possible to bear, and we hope that the stories that come out of these books are going to resonate with many, many people. We are still incredibly lucky to be able to think about the future, because there are many groups in society who don't have this luxury, because, you know, for them the future is being able to put something on the table tomorrow, or to heat their house tomorrow, or having hot water. So we are still incredibly privileged, and the voices we manage to bring in to think about the future are also privileged, because they have this luxury to be able to think about the future. So we are trying hard to make it as diverse as possible. It's a work in progress, and we hope this gets disseminated as widely as possible. So now we have more or less introduced ourselves. I'm going to move to how the book was made and the project went on. the process that really led to producing this beautiful book, another bit of publicity. So Stephen, I'm going to hand over to you for a few minutes to do a quick summary from the editor's perspective on the process of creating this.
Okay, so this is definitely a skim across the top. So had you have met me and Ben at the point that this was being finished, we were both. So you get the point. But so yes, to skim across the top of it, the first part of the process was really with Cybersalon throwing ideas around amongst themselves with us. In terms of the themes, we had to decide on the themes. So what are important themes coming over the hill, and not important technologies, but important sort of societal themes. That was important. Having done that, we then moved on to, okay, so we need a couple of experts in this, and obviously with that you have to kind of think, well, you have to have an idea, not narrow, but a narrower idea of where you want to go than just this big, whether it's learning and education. So who are our experts? So you kind of, we talked that through, and then thankfully those experts agreed. And then with that, we iterated with them. We either iterated or incremented.
Right. There was iteration in this bit. That's
Ben pulled me up on my misuse of the word iteration earlier. So we iterated the kind of a 200-word description of the theme, so that we could then go out, publicly open call for writers rather than stories, and that was really important to us because we wanted to get people involved in talking to each other early on. If you just go out for stories, you're going to get a story. If you go out for an author, you're going to get a person. So we did that. There was some criteria. We had samples of writing, all sorts of things, and we chose our writers. And we're doing this for 5 themes. Having got to that stage, the experts themselves had put together a few kind of links to articles or videos or whatever, which we used as prompt materials for the writers, who then came back with 200 words of the ideas behind the story they wanted to write. And at that point, we did this separately for each theme, but we got experts, authors, me and Ben, into a Zoom call to then spend 90 minutes, 2 hours talking through those ideas and kind of pulling them apart a bit. And, I certainly changed one of my stories as a result of that Zoom call. In fact, it was the one that you were in with me, Liz. So having done that, the stories were then drafted, came back in for the experts to have a look at. We had a caveat, which was if any idea in any of these stories is too toxic for you to be associated with it, dear expert, then you have a veto over that idea. Since the first project, me and Christine together, it's been commonly known as the Black Mirror's okay, Terminator's not. So basically, an apocalypse, I'm not sure. Questioning is fine. Once the stories were completed, the experts then got those stories and they wrote their commentary on the ideas in those stories, knowing that they didn't have to agree with the ideas, they could point out if they thought things were missing. So what we were trying to do to sort of summarise all that is bring all those rich conversations that have been going on onto the page so that other people could kind of get an insight and read into those and use those ideas and the commentary beyond what we'd done. So that's not a particularly quick overview of the process, but considering it was 2 years, it's a fairly quick overview.
Make it sound easy. Let's do it again.
Yeah.
But and another, I would say, an original aspect of the book is that then not only the book brought together all these stories, but that on each of the themes, the experts wrote a comment. So that was also something.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
That was not part of the first.
No, it wasn't.
project?
No. So the first project, being a live event, was really, we went out, commissioned stories, read the stories to set up the discussion, had the discussion, job was done.
Yeah.
It was very much that discussion part was the fun part, and we had to find ways to engineer that in pretty much iteratively at every stage, right?
Yeah. So, the academics, you ended up having to write as well comments on the stories in your topics, but the question I would have, start stepping a bit from what we've been talking about, this whole experience of interacting with the authors and then writing your bits and so on, how does it differ from your day job as an academic? I mean, what space does it occupy in your job as an academic? Where do I start? Liz, this time. Put you on the spot.
Well, I mean, it's very different to my day job as an academic. And I guess, and that was what was so nice about it, right? It gave me the opportunity to step back and really, well, in a way, I suppose it forced me to take that time to step back and do that kind of reflection that I know is so important and that I know is so valuable and that I want to do, but the kind of pressures of the day-to-day job normally mean that's the kind of thing that always gets pushed to the side. So committing to do something like this is great because it means I'm committed to doing it, so I will then take that time to really kind of engage with the stories, the discussions with the authors, the questions that brought up. So I found it a really kind of valuable and useful experience.
Claire?
Yeah, well, I think it was definitely a different experience for me as well. But some things are similar to some of the work that I do. So in medical research, we try always to involve participants and public in what we do, especially right from the design phase of a research project. So we'll always go and try and discuss our ideas and see whether they are problematic in any way or could be tweaked. And almost always they are changed by the process of discussing with patients and the public. And that's a really important part of research. So that element of like engagement with others is similar. But what's quite different here is the sense that I might put a few things out there to the writers that I thought might be interesting material. But then they were completely free to explore it themselves, and it might go in a completely different direction to what maybe I'd anticipated, and so that's quite exciting. It's quite a, in a sense, liberating, but also a bit scary thing to do as a scientist, because you're really letting go of your ideas and seeing where they float out to, and so it's a bit of trepidation, I guess, around that. And also, inevitably, there are going to be ideas which maybe clash a little bit. I was expecting that, really. And wasn't really worried about that, because I think that always means that you maybe learn and have good discussions. But yeah, so in that sense, it's really different. And the other thing that's really different, I suppose, was working with artists, if I can say that writers are artists. I mean, people who they're really doing their own creation. So again, that's another aspect of, in a sense, in science we sort of create, but here we were letting others create with maybe a bit of stimulus from us. So that was really interesting and new.
Stephen, how is it different from your day job? Because now that you are retired and are a full-time writer...
I'm a full-time writer, I'm not retired. But
No, I agree.
I no longer have a 9-to-5 job. Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's probably more similarities from being a full-time writer in this for me. But I think the main difference from being a writer and to being involved in this is, if you're a writer, you're pretty much on your own, aren't you? Occasionally you kind of like interact with an editor, or hopefully you've got friends and stuff. But in terms of what you're doing, it's all inside your head. So what I really like about all this stuff is this collaboration piece, is that you are kind of thinking things through with other people. You're your worldview is being challenged quite a lot, which is great. It's an absolute gold dust way to do research. I mean, rather than reading articles or watching YouTube or whatever it is, you can sit down and talk to the people that are actually developing and researching this stuff. So that's different. I think the other thing that's different, which is possibly more difficult, is that it does put constraints on your writing, because you are writing for a purpose. You're writing something that if you're doing it properly, you're giving the experts a kind of the occasional thing they can stand on and talk about the idea, and it has to be plausible. So, you know, if you're writing sci-fi, you don't, well, you know, there's a whole other big argument as to whether it has to be plausible or not, but you have to kind of constrain yourself for that purpose, which actually can be quite interesting and quite productive, but it is a difference, I would say.
Ben, your day job.
Yeah, so, well, my day job, we'll start there. So I'm a developer, software engineer. I work in e-commerce, so my day job is quite removed from the process and the artifice of writing, but quite similar to the job of Cybersalon. So where it's that the technologies that drove the interest of Cybersalon, the digitization, the internet and its media blurrings, have very much been part of my day-to-day business, but not so much in critiquing them, more in sort of developing solutions in and around them. And I suppose, I mean, the thing I often say is that, you know, working even as a hard tech engineer in startups, it's not a place devolved of stories. There's still a lot of storytelling going on, you know. Most of the founders that I work with from day one on development, they don't have a product yet, but they have a story about what they want that product to be. So that was always an interesting twist, as what storytelling does in the technology space.
Yes, that's interesting.
Maybe another book. And when it comes to the job of, like I say, it's quite a project management piece, making this thing happen, which sort of Stephen alluded to. So there's definitely part of your project management brain cuts in when you're just coordinating everybody's, well, these workshops were 7 or 8 people all available at the same time. Just the logistics of booking that sometimes was a challenge. They were all quite busy people.
I think it's like 34 people involved in it that are in something. That's quite a, as you say, project management task.
Yeah, I'm glad I've had some skills in that. But yeah, it's quite different from I wouldn't mind it being my day job, but you know, it isn't my day job.
Okay. From all of you in turn, I would like to know what was the biggest couple of takeaways or surprises you had during the project and what came out in the stories. So, okay, I'm going to start. Yeah, with Claire on one side and go on this line.
I think one of the things that is obvious, but it was a surprise to me, is that the stories are really from a single person viewpoint. And so, whereas when I'm thinking in science or whatever, I'm often thinking in terms of populations or groups of people, or maybe different groups interacting or so on. I'm not really thinking from an individual perspective. And so when I was suddenly reading the stories, it was very, very individual based, sort of like from the point of view of the protagonist in the story. And all of a sudden I'm sort of thinking, well, yeah, but what about everybody else in that society? What about everybody else there? Would it be the same for everyone else? What are the other people? And obviously with a short story, there's only a certain amount of leeway that the person has to then think about the rest of the society. But then a lot of what I was then going on to think about is, well, actually, what are the implications for everyone else in this structure or in this place? And then I was sort of pondering about the fact that, of course, stories are about individuals, but also a lot of the stories in my, well, I think there were 2 strong themes that I felt were coming through in the health and longevity piece. One was about individual identity in these new worlds, and the other one was around autonomy, which is a really, really strong human drive and very important in the medical world, that it's the fundamental thing that, in a sense, doctors need to do, is protect their patients' autonomy to make decisions ultimately and enable them to carry out the lives that they want to carry out. And I suppose, so I wasn't surprised to see autonomy coming out as a really strong feature, but I think that then, when reading all the rest of the stories, it comes out in a lot of the other stories as well. So I'm not sure whether that was a surprise. It wasn't really a surprise, but it was a very strong takeaway.
Liz?
Yeah, so I guess I was really struck, so from the stories in the section that I was involved with, particularly by the how much focus there was on the relationships between the characters in the stories and this technology and these different types of relationships, and how they could be beneficial or not beneficial, and how that kind of got me thinking about how might this change us as individuals, but also change the way that we interact with people and with technology around us. So yeah, that was I guess one of the kind of key takeaways from the story. And probably the thing I was most surprised by was, so I was a bit apprehensive about it because it's very different to the type of writing this commentary is very different to the type of kind of very technical, formal writing that I normally do. And I suppose I was surprised actually how kind of, not easy, but how kind of naturally it came, that the ideas and the questions in the stories really resonated with me, and it was, I guess, kind of helped kind of really crystallize and kind of articulate these things that I had been thinking anyway, but kind of reading these stories in the context that it gave me to really kind of identify these questions that are, that then, just being able to kind of articulate these questions that are so important and that I have been kind of dwelling on. So that was a real surprise, that actually, I guess the things that I'd been worried about, that maybe I was going to be, find this totally impossible to do, actually, when it came to doing it, actually came kind of quite naturally then.
Good. Ben?
So I would just, Liz, that's great. We've not gotten together as a group, like this particular group, since assembling this thing and putting it all together. As you can hear, it's in 5 sections, and they were kind of treated very much like discrete sections. There was a common mechanism and some common threads that you'd see if you read it. They were mechanically quite distinct sections. So first ones came back off the press. We did manage to grab a pub somewhere in London, start handing them out to some of the writers, and I don't think any of you could join that night. But, it absolutely was one of those goals to be hearing, that, we're getting into the detail of the story and pulling out the threads, as you were saying. It was really nice to hear that. I almost take that down as one of my takeaways, is that actually it's working. It's surprising to hear that kind of feedback, that, it does actually work as a process. So a generation of experts that got into round 2 had a similar takeaway to those people that came into round 1, which is really nice. The other thing I think I'd say from this, and I've done some fiction writing, but not a great deal myself. I certainly learned a lot about fiction writing. Things that you've probably heard somebody say before, that when you're doing world building, it's just the background. Yeah, it's great to hear the story about the technology, but the thing that sells the world is the people living in it, their interactions within it, their interactions with the world that you've built. And I think Stephen said before that for writers to have access to that concrete and actualized bit of data and detail that's coming in from the experts really does engage the writer in that process. Like, okay, so that might happen, but that can't happen. Okay, I'm off, the better story goes. So, I'm genuinely surprised that it worked as well as it did. Is that okay?
Yes, you're ready for the next round.
Not yet, not this yet.
Stephen.
So I think, I don't know if it's a surprise, but it's stuck with me a lot, and it's the materials that Liz put forward with, I remember them as debating AIs, and this notion of how these things can be positive if you understand how they're working and you use them in a particular way, and that's what I built into my story. But I think, for me, that's kind of sent me on a bit of a trajectory now to look out a little bit more for those, okay, there's all this noise about blah, 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 but actually, when you really look at this, what are the positives? How can these things be used in a way that can, I think we were saying, like humans and AI together, that it can be better. We're not competing necessarily and all that. I'm not trying to put too much agency on AIs, by the way. So I think that was kind of really key for me. The other thing, this is a bit of an anecdote, and Jayen's here from the College of Policing, who was one of our experts in the police and justice section. So you'll forgive me telling an anecdote about our Zoom meeting. But there was a moment where there was a discussion going on from the expert side of things. I can't remember who it was, but around a particular story from a long time ago, and we've all heard it. The policeman undercover that has a relationship with the activist that he's kind of meant to be looking into, has a child and all this sort of thing. And then one of our authors, who I would say is probably an activist, it's a broad term, said, yeah, that was my mate. And what really got me was we've actually got people in this room from very different perspectives, all together trying to work through what the future of police and justice might look like, and you know, possibly people that wouldn't, from different, you know, coming from different angles, maybe wouldn't have a chance to have these sorts of conversations. And I think that for me that really crystallized what we were trying to do with this. And I think because it's through stories, it makes it a lot easier to kind of have those conversations. So yeah, that's the little anecdote that I think kind of is a key takeaway. Surprise. I don't know whether it's a takeaway or surprise, but I'm sure we could maybe a surprise takeaway.
That's a surprise at the time, yeah.
My own takeaway was I was extremely privileged because I was charged with writing a postface, which was going to be cross-cutting the book. So I was privileged to watch all the Zoom meetings between the authors and the experts, and usually on my own time because they were recorded specifically for me, which was absolutely lovely. And initially, the brief I had was that I was going to comment on the expert comment, but then when it came time to write it, I realized this wasn't cutting it because this was not going to make any kind of nice reading to comments on comments that were already commenting on at the start. I was like, no. And what it did for me was I had this kind of eureka moment because I've been working with Stephen, like I said, for 8 years now on many different sorts of projects. From scientific projects in which we are both embedded and with a very kind of constrained brief for what we do, to entirely freewheeling projects where we are organizing, like at the moment, creative writing competitions for young kids, or all sorts of things. And I've been really trying to find a way academically in my research to give a conceptual framework to what I'm doing, because all this, in a way, is action-based research. And suddenly, writing the postface, having watched all the Zoom meetings, I had this kind of eureka moment I was running after for a long time that just brought for me exactly what I'm doing. It took me 8 years to figure it out, but that's great. And so now I am in the process of writing it as an academic. But more generally, what I've found writing, not only for this book, but for the previous one where I was this time also writing a postface, but from a different angle.
You interviewed all the writers.
Yeah, I interviewed all the writers, or writing comments on some of Stephen's stories, writing a foreword for one of your books.
You did? Yeah.
Yes, is that when I do this kind of writing, I mean, as an academic, I'm not a scientist like Claire and Liz. I'm really a qualitative social scientist, occasionally a contemporary historian of science. So I write in a format, it is already that of a, not fiction, but in a way, creative writing, essay format. But it's academic essays. So you worry, you start with your literature review, you worry about all your references. When I'm writing for these guys, I actually only worry about the narrative and making something that is nice to read and not having to worry in any way about referencing anything. And it makes for a very different way of writing, which is, let's face it, a lot more enjoyable most of the time, but also very complementary, because that's when I'm looking for these narrative threads that I find actually the hard line is what I'm looking for, but I can then expand as an academic with all the proper literature review and referencing. So yes, that's both, this one was a surprise because this eureka moment came like, whoosh, and was good, like, oh, after 8 years, finally. But more generally, in my day job, because it's very complementary to what I do in my day job. I think it's improved my writing a lot to do that. Wicked. I know. Okay, so going back to the academics, or the experts ones, not me, the topic experts. How did it feel being paired with another expert? Because what we haven't, I don't know if we've said it, but on each of the sections, so the themes, we had 2 experts per theme who were paired together on the same Zoom meeting. Well, first to recommend material to the authors, but then during the Zoom chat to discuss the ideas with the authors. And sometimes the 2 experts were not necessarily agreeing or were coming from very different directions. So how did it feel to be paired with these people? Liz?
Well, I mean, it was very interesting experience. So I was paired with Danby, who's a neuroscientist, so we were in the learning area of the book. So obviously coming at learning then from a kind of very different perspective than my perspective, which is more the kind of machine learning and how does AI learn from these things. So that was really fascinating, and I found it just really interesting to be exposed to their ideas, but also the way that Danby approaches their research, I think is, I had the impression, and we didn't get a lot of time to speak a lot, it was through these meetings, but I had the impression that they take a much more kind of creative approach to doing things than certainly than I've kind of been exposed to, and I found that really valuable as well. It was, just meeting different people that
I would venture Danby is a very unusual neuroscientist.
Yeah.
Having worked with a lot of neuroscientists, they are very, very unusual neuroscientists.
Yeah. Well, it was fantastic. I mean, it was great to get that. I mean, I found it really inspirational and, fascinating, and not something I would have imagined actually from a neuroscientist as well, right? I suppose. It was great. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's a really good example. So there's so much diversity, isn't there, in science, and it's really great to be able to interact with that diversity. And I guess the same was true with me and David Wood, who of course is not here to sort of say where he comes from, but I think we are quite different in our approach to ageing. I think it's fair to say that David is, he's very much in the sort of futurist, transgenerationist sort of conceptualization of aging. So thinking about, well, actually, how could we really extend human lifespan and maybe even live for a very long time, sort of maybe even hundreds of years. Maybe we could even, find new ways of living through. And that's very, very different from my perspective of what I'm working on, which is more about, not about extending lifespan. I find that a problematic thing to think about too much, for various reasons we could go into, but really about thinking about the lifespan that we have and trying to make sure that it's as healthy as possible, so that we can have a full active participation in this wonderful but transient life that we are all given. And so it would, it was a little bit scary to sort of be together with David, to be fair, because I was thinking, thinking, oh, what's this going to be like? But actually what's really interesting, and also interesting if you read our commentaries, how much synergy there is, because ultimately we both take a very positive approach to what can be done. So I think David's feeling is very much that a lot of problems that might relate to aging can be solved if we understand them scientifically. And I guess that's also an approach that I take, that actually many conditions of aging are actually phenomenon that we can study and understand and potentially either reverse or prevent. And so in a way, there's not that much difference. It's just in a sense, what is the aim of the game? Is it, I don't have any intention to live longer than my allotted time, but I would like to live it healthily. And that's the goal that I'm looking for.
It's really interesting to hear you both there, actually, because when we were thinking through who our experts were going to be in the different sections, we did think quite carefully about what's that dynamic that we're creating. So it's interesting that there was a dynamic in both of those.
And yes, and Gabby is not here to talk about the environmental and energy topic, but I think the dynamic between Gabrielle Samuel and Richard Heap, who was the other expert on energy and environment, how complementary even in their ways of thinking they were, because it was also, and it transpires in the commentaries, because they were both talking to the blind spot of the other in many ways, I think, and they were very complementary. So that was a pretty cool pairing. Well, Gabby's not here to say whether she enjoyed it. Well, she told me she enjoyed it.
She did.
Yeah. So message is she really enjoyed doing this project. She's, she would do it again anytime, but unfortunately she's not there to say it herself. Last point about the process from the editors, like what were the benefits for you of the iterative approach, really, of choosing authors rather than stories?
So, I mean, we've talked about that quite a bit.
Yeah.
The collaboration, the talking through ideas, the working together, having a little bit of time for things to kind of percolate, for things to change. And I mean, so for example, I wrote in the learning and education one, inspired by the debating AIs, brought my ideas to the Zoom meeting. And I think anyone actually said that's rubbish, but it was a very lukewarm response, I have to say. So I kind of went away and thought, okay, so I need to rethink this a little bit. And spent an afternoon with Danby, because I wanted to bring in something around neurotype into it, and we talked through, and she persuaded me to buy the second edition of Maslow's whenever it was. Anyhow, but that kind of iterative and incremental approach is not something that I would normally encounter to that level, I don't think. The other thing that I'm picking up, and I'm hoping I'm picking up right, is that because we kind of spent time together, the ideas were kind of built up together, that it feels like the ownership of the book is much broader than if people had just pitched in a story to an anthology. I mean, obviously you feel kind of part of that anthology, but just from the way people have been talking, and certainly the way a lot of the writers have been kind of behaving around this, it feels like a real ownership of it, which I'm absolutely pleased about. And I think you talked about risk and stuff like that. It was a very risky process for everybody. I think everyone took risks in it. Whether that was us not knowing what the stories were going to be like, experts have talked about it. But I think, again, spending a bit of time with each other and having this kind of slow burn process turned that from being risky, where you are feeling a bit brittle, to, okay, we can kind of lean into this, which don't think would have been the case had it not have had a few rounds of different things as we went through the process. So that's a few ideas about what about the iterative stuff.
I think that's fair. And I'd probably come back on the same thing again. It's the process. So the approach, if you like. I mean, we're not the first people to write speculative fiction. We're certainly not the first people to do foresighting. But the approach that we took was very much informed of the earlier, smaller prototype kind of project, and that feedback of experts asking to be involved in the storytelling process sooner. So the whole thing really, that first sort of like few months of that 2-year process was working out how on earth we would do that. And that did give us fairly concrete, so well, there's only so much of anybody's time we can use. So if the subject matter is what we get to decide, then the story has to be something that everybody gets to decide on. So we have to make that, where does that line up in the process? And once we thought we'd figured that out, I mean, Zoe's looking at me here saying, did you figure this out? I was just winging it as you went along. Hopefully we figured it out. But once we had figured it out, we had that process to lean back on when we had the second section, the third and the fourth and the fifth. And that was the only bit we really had, was like, okay, we found our expert pair. We kind of have the poles, if you like, of the discussion. We've got some really interested writers who have some domain knowledge as well. They had some overlap there. We saw that was part of when we did the open call for writers. So whatever else happens, we'll get a discussion out of this. So, okay, if we get a discussion that leads to a story, then we can edit some stories, okay. And if we got enough stories, we can have some commentary, okay. And we were able to lean back on that process. And I think by the time we'd got through the fourth one, it almost felt like we knew what we were doing. So, yeah, having that process in play and being able to rest on that when the practicalities sort of flew up in front of it made it easier to do, yeah.
So I'd say we all knew what we were doing, we were just getting better at it.
There you go, I'll take that. I'll make a note of that for next time.
For you too, how did you, what for you the benefits of this iterative approach and having a chance to veto any toxic ideas ideas you would have found toxic, and a side question, because you both wrote comments, was your day job at all limiting in what you could say or write?
That's an interesting one. Well, limiting only in the sense that time is very short. Obviously you could engage. This is something which you could engage to a lot of degree with, and so there's only a limited amount of time, I suppose. But one thing, the thing that's sort of echoing in my head is around the clear sort of like there's one story in particular that was really fantastic and really got me thinking, and that is about. Am I allowed to sort of go into a bit of detail? As geriatricians, gerontologists and so on, we talk about this idea of squaring the curve of life. So the idea is that unfortunately, as currently exists, people sort of maybe, say, take any function in life, it tends to grow through childhood, reach a peak in adulthood, and then gradually something happens to that function and it tends to change and get worse towards the end of life, and then obviously people die. And so if you can imagine that's a curve, the idea, the sort of goal for many people who study sort of aging is to say, well, okay, how could we stretch out that time that someone is in their peak performance all the way to the end of life? And then, wouldn't that be much better, because people would have a lot of function for as long as possible? And of course, then there's the futurists or whatever who might want to extend that forever. But obviously, unless it's extended forever, there's a point at which that ends. There's a point at which then somebody then dies. And I suppose one of the stories, which is by Britta, I think, basically talks about, what would that be like? Number one, what would it be to extend life? And then actually, if we all looked the same age, this was a really fantastic thing. If we all looked the same age, how could we tell who's who's had the same experiences as us. You know, if I went into a room, I couldn't tell whether somebody might have remembered, I don't know, Margaret Thatcher or not, because I couldn't know how old they were, and how would that then change our interactions? But then, of course, then what happens if suddenly we get to the end of life and everything's sort of changing suddenly? How do we deal with that sudden change? And there was another story, wasn't there, that came through, which I think in the end wasn't published, which we didn't come through, which was around exactly that, around how we could actually plan for that using, say, for example, in a little bit like a person who's giving birth might have a doula to go through the path, the sort of experience of giving birth, that also we could have some kind of doulas which could help us pass through that transition towards death. And I think that's something that is really thought-provoking, and maybe we as a society need to do an awful lot more thinking about death and how we really talk about it, talk about how we deal with it, because unless we're going to all be futurists and the world might look a little bit different then it's going to happen to all of us.
Any thoughts about the several steps project? The iterative and incremental,
Yes.
like an agile method of kind.
I mean, I think, not having experienced an alternative, but it definitely, I suppose, made me feel more comfortable engaging with the stories, having been part of that kind of process and got to speak with the authors and just, you know, see the progression. It helped me to kind of understand the perspectives and engage with that, and definitely feel kind of more comfortable kind of commenting on it. And when you were saying about the, you know, having the veto to, I mean, there were none of the stories that I read that I felt that I, you know, even slightly needed to think about that. But I think that is reassuring to have that possibility. I think there are, I don't know, I think particularly around AI, there's a lot of unhelpful narrative that's getting played out in the media that I probably would not want to be associated with, or, you know, would not want to kind of support. I mean, you know, there are ways of kind of couching these things, I think. But so, I think that was important. And I think similarly as well, I mean, I think the only way I felt restricted by my day job was in the lack of time to engage more as I would like to do. But
And there were, not many, but there were some instances of experts coming back and saying, actually, not very comfortable with that.
Oh yeah.
Which usually meant an author just slightly too. I mean, the first one I did at Bristol, I think my robot was a carnivorous robot or something. Change that.
There was one that I was interested in, which we haven't talked about. I can't remember whose story it was, but it was around menopause, as a feature of aging. And in the story, I felt quite uncomfortable about it. I don't know whether I didn't really write about it in the commentary because it felt to me that the reason I was uncomfortable is because it felt that menopause was taken as an aging thing and a fully negative thing. And actually, I'm interested in that. I think there is quite a lot of a flavour about that. And I'm not sure it is entirely a negative thing. So I wanted there to be a bit of play. But I think there was a little bit of a dialogue around that. But ultimately, it is ultimately that there's a freedom there to discuss. And maybe that's a discussion point, isn't it?
Yeah.
Should I respond to that? Because that was my story.
I thought it might be.
You know, we make it sound really very peaceful. We argued all the time. It was a very tension-full project. And, my point about menopause is that I'm surrounded by my younger colleagues who are too busy with their careers and forgot to have children. And this period when you have children is so unforgiving. It's such a short period. And it comes from the time when we only live 20 years or something.
Yeah.
So my protest with the story about extending fertility beyond menopause was not that I think menopause is a bad thing, but our society is structured against women having choices. And I also don't like Aldous Huxley, who ruined the idea of external birth pods for everybody for about 100 years. So, there was a lot there, but it wasn't against menopause. It was just, we are questioning everything. Why we're not questioning the pain point that ruins so many female careers and female lives when you have to make these choices, where medicine is there, you could extend it easily. But I just wanted to bring it to the point where cultural differences, for me, the key point from the writing point of view was that we spent a lot of time with David in America, so I do work in California. Californians lived way in the future, way in the future. So the idea of death, it's just not a thing. The idea of very long life, preferably forever, is a thing. So when you look at how people deploy resources, there's a lot more institutes for longevity in about 100 miles from Santa Barbara to San Obispo than in the whole Europe. Because they think that that's something we should be thinking about. It's an engineering challenge that we would like Claire to be around forever. We would like Lise to be around forever. Why are we not researching how to make you two be around for 200 years? They would say our attitude is too modest. So this was interesting, what was coming out of the book. But there are also other painful thing, which we discovered with JM, that we always think that there's an amazing bunch of new tools that everybody like police is using, and then you discover that most of these tools were developed by Vodafone 30 years ago for completely different reasons, and we're just dealing with the fallout of that. So we learned a lot about what actually is out there. So that was probably a key thing for us in the book, that things are not as rosy as we think.
I loved your story. It wasn't your story that I was reacting to, actually. I think your story was Journey to Linda's Farn Abbey, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Which, no, it was the other one. There was the other one which was much more negative.
Yes.
But anyway, that's do read the book because they're both really, really interesting stories. Yeah.
Okay, yes, and plug, it's 0.99 pence.
Yeah.
No, pounds. 99 pence as a Kindle on Amazon. Oh gosh, I'm paying somebody for Amazon.
Nice.
Okay.
Having a physical
Something
one
to
as well.
worth it. Yeah.
And you can buy the physical one
Yes.
as well. So, a lot of choices. I'm going to wrap up with a so what question, the outcomes of the project beyond the book. Ben for Cybersalon, basically what did you and Cybersalon learn about the actual themes, the cross-cutting themes that emerge of this, and actually as a think tank, how will Cybersalon use this book?
Okay, those are good questions. Ava actually just pointed to some of that. I mean, the first answer here is like Cybersalon as an organisation is still learning. So all of its members, they do have their day jobs, which aren't academia normally and aren't writing, but we've got ours to do. It came out from quite a few members actually involved in the process that the presence of the writer, the artist in the room, they do ask questions that your engineering, say, regular staff colleagues wouldn't ask. They're exactly the sort of the edge case questions. So then you go, oh, I hadn't quite thought of that. Let's go into that, which brings out all those kind of like edge cases to day-to-day deployment where you're not deploying to experts, you're not working with them. So there's that ongoing learning anyway. So we will make sure all the members read it, obviously, as the first piece. But the process of Cybersalon's day job, if you like, to run workshops, to do events. We have events scheduled at the RSA in September and October. We'll probably do some of those workshops again, although for maybe a slightly different audience, either through Westminster University or at New Speak House out in Stratford. So please feel free to keep an eye out on cybersalon.org, attend any of those. Because, the story is a great interface to the discussion, and you can get that conversation started. Further to that, we've got a few sort of statements. It's there in the introduction, the preface, and you've sort of heard it in the methodology behind the book, which is this, and it's odd, I don't think we've used the word foresighting yet in the conversation.
No.
So do you mind if I
Go
a little
ahead.
moment there? So we've got a collection of short science fiction stories, right? But at no point have we said this is how the future's going to be. The idea is much more, foresight is not forecast, Right? So we're not saying, hey, we are a bunch of digital experts in digital transformation. We've worked out what the future is going to be. It's going to be like this. Go read our 25 stories about how it pans out. Quite the reverse. It's, okay, we are gathering as many different, goes back to the diversity point, as many different plausible futures that could happen. So foresighting is each and every one of these very different futures is similarly plausible and allows us to draw out either a societal tension or a deployment tension or a practical edge case that you might not otherwise have thought of if all you'd been exposed to up until this point was a sales pitch from, techcorp.com or whoever they were. So the process of foresighting, finding ways to do that piece of engagement in as broad and as wide a process as possible, the open futures story, is something that Cybersalon will be developing more in the manifesto plan. How else, what other than short fiction can do open futures? What other processes of engagement can do that? Because I think we've seen returns on this particular path. So see more of that from us.
Good. Academics, how may you use some of the book's content in your research and your teaching?
Shall I go? I mean, I think, so I think it's been really, it's been such a valuable exercise for me, and I think I would really love to get some of our students to do something similar, to take some of the stories from this book and do their own reflection. And it's, in this centre with the PhD students that we train, it's so important. They're going to be the future researchers, engineers of AI. So important to get them to appreciate the value and the importance of doing this kind of thing. And I think by doing it, you really see the value of it. Really, it becomes very clear immediately how kind of reflecting with these kind of stories in this way, what you can learn from that. So yeah, I think we should think about getting the students to do this next year.
Happy to do that.
That's great. I was thinking more about actually getting my students or postdocs and so on to read it and read the different versions, and maybe we could get together and have a discussion as to their reactions to the content, because I have one set of reactions, but I'm sure that other people, even within my profession, would have a completely different set of reactions, and maybe that might actually be really interesting about generating new ideas of things to research.
And I'm going to add, through the project I've run with Stephen, we have a pile of stories that have come out of the various projects we've done together. And notably, I've used some when I was, for 3 years running, until last year, I was running a master's course on the ethical and social implications of AI, big data, and algorithms for health research and healthcare. And instead of assigning them, I assigned them papers to read, but I also, for some seminars, assigned them stories to read, and I invited Stephen actually to come to a seminar to answer questions about stories he had developed for a specific digital psychiatry project in which we are involved. And it's very interesting what the questions of the students are different, but especially in the second year I ran this course, one of, for me, a fantastic moment was that one of my students then was participating in an essay writing competition in the department, but it was meant to be a traditional sort of academic kind of writing essay, not non-fiction. And she asked, can I write fiction? And she actually won the essay competition because after the course, she wrote a fantastic short story that was really applied science fiction around the use of femtech, about ovulation sort of prediction apps for managing your period and so on. And it was this moment like, actually, I can write this as a story. And so there was the moment, this kind of moment when actually, and students getting excited about writing creative fiction instead of traditional essays. So like, oh, can I mix actually some bits of, personal vignettes in my end of, assessment essay instead of just writing a pure, it's like, yeah, okay, go ahead. And so that's very interesting. So that was my my own takeaway, not from this book, but from previous projects, that actually you can mix it with teaching and it makes for quite nice stuff. I'm going to stop there because we are going to run late afterward, and I would like to give you a chance to ask questions because we've been talking a lot. So do we have a roving mic somewhere? Because I know, Eva was talking and we didn't. I saw the mic at the back, but I was a bit late. So any questions, or we walk to? Yeah. So one there.
This is slightly related to Prof. Steve's takeaway, I think it was, about from the individual perspective to the population perspective. So as new technologies have such an impact on existing inequalities and everything else, did you include the speculative arts movements from communities that are most impacted, like the Black speculative arts movement or indigenous futurisms or others globally?
That's for
Or
the
will you?
editors.
Sorry, it could also be a future question.
Yeah. When you say do you mean did we include them in terms of writing in the book?
Yeah, either to include for authors or to consult with them about how that might affect inequalities going forward, or just invite papers from them, that kind of thing, or will you in future?
So I think the answer to that is yes, as much as we could at the time, but not as much as we would have liked to have done. And yes, going forward. Prescient, so Prescient's one of our writers in the power and energy section.
Yeah, so my short story was about, well, we've all sort of heard the narrative about how solar power and stuff like that's going to become very cheap. But this was really just talking about 20 years in the future, what if it's remains unaffordable and the finance system doesn't sort of respond. So it's basically, the story is really about somebody who becomes criminalized for working in finance in the West, but effectively giving away money so that the people in the South can actually afford and take advantage of it. And it's all works out very well, but eventually, because the climate is collapsing around them, that particular country in Africa still sort of loses out. But he's very much into community energy, sort of local village level anti sort of desertification kind of policies, sort of from the grassroots.
I had a second question came from,
So I'm a little bit, I have to sort out my schizophrenia here because I'm an academic, I'm a chief data officer, and I'm a science fiction writer. So I'll try to collapse everything down.
There's like 3 copies of the book.
Yeah.
Paperback and hardback.
I think one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is, as a writer, well, as all 3, is not just the implications of the technology, but in and of itself, but what its part in a larger paradigmatic shift in thought, philosophy, way of living. And it's a kind of a cross-cutting thing across all the different topics, and is kind of in a sense emerging out of that. So I was wondering if kind of looking at those broader implications. I mean, you talked about the specific themes, the kind of emerging interactions of all of these different things, and I think particularly about questions around energy, sustainability, economics, artificial intelligence, and our sense of identity even, and how they all kind of come together. So a little bit kind of how do we look at these larger interactions?
Can I take a bit of that? Okay, so when we were right in the very beginning, when we were sitting there saying, okay, if this is going to end up being a book, should it have a theme, an overarching one? And also that actually led us to the 30-year out sort of date, the 30 to 50-year out date, was kind of a where was 30 back. I think this does sort of speak to that. And I think what I also want to draw out is what happened afterwards when we realised, A, that this goal we'd sort of half set ourselves out on wasn't really going to manifest in the book. But then as we sit back and read the stories, we can see we didn't actually ask for this theme either, but it's turned up in 2 sections of the book that we weren't planning for. What's happened here? So the intended goal was to talk about longevity in AI across that 30, 60-year cycle, and expect everybody was going to buy into that throughout the whole book. You know, the political story that Cybersalon was trying to sell to itself, if you like, at that point was, well, no one's going to kick it down the road if they're still going to be alive when the ball stops rolling. So clearly we found the way through this puzzle. And what we often found when we started talking about longevity is like, I don't want to live forever. You know, it seemed to be the bias more than the other way around. So that made that challenging. We're like, oh, our overarching themes have now diminished to just one, which are always going to be the data and the machine learning piece. So that's everywhere. And I think the impact that datafication and machine learning, those transformations on society in a whole, will turn up in every section of the book, wherever you look. And then the one we didn't plan for and then turned up, we often tell this story as a side effect of the world building. And that, you know, when you're writing stories about tech, as we've said before, you tend to write stories that have got tech in them. And nobody wants to read a story about a toaster, really, but they are much more interested in who had toast for breakfast and what they did with their day. So if you've done your world building right, then everything else that's going on in the world that character then inhabits and does is also well informed. So when we started to find climate change turn up in sections that we weren't going about power and energy, we thought, hang on, we might be onto something here. And if maybe we're not onto a policy issue or a debate about climate, but we're certainly onto quality of world building. And if you want a book of science fiction stories, it's quite nice to have quality world building.
I think, and what I'd add to that, so I completely agree. And also, it's kind of inevitable, as you'll know, when you're writing anything in the future, that you're trying to think about what does that society look like in the future. So I think there's quite a lot right across it where a different type of society is portrayed, even if it's not explicit in terms of that particular story. So I think it's almost a natural outcome of kind of what we were doing. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a bit.
Yeah, I mean, there are more dramatic difference. Some story worlds feel dramatically different from the one you currently inhabit, and others feel remarkably familiar. I'll let you enjoy.
All right, so my name is Henry. I first want to thank you all for just your wonderful discussion. So my question is, first off, concepts like artificial intelligence and biological mortality are basically holy grails in their respective fields. Mm-hmm. And from what I could tell, that these stories kind of presume that they're either completely attained or at least attained to a degree where it's almost considered solved. My question then is, do these stories, do the researchers consider what these new goals will be if, let's say, you get artificial intelligence at the level of a human able to run governments and businesses, or biological mortality where everyone basically looks the same? Yes, these questions will be solved. Yes, there's social implications, but what will then be the new horizon for science?
Scientist.
That's a really interesting question. So I'm just thinking back to the kind of range of the stories that I saw, and I think, so I wouldn't agree that they all assume that AI has been solved. So I think, they kind of have differing extents, but some of them really weren't that far in the future, given where we are now with large language models. They weren't kind of assuming that we've got AGI and there's nowhere else to go with AI. It was really, and as some of them, but they were really just not looking so far forward, right? I mean, where we are now with the kind of what we see, things like ChatGPT and the way, you interact with that, and it seems like it is intelligent, right? And that's what a lot of these, these different types of technologies in these stories So on the one hand, I don't think they're implausible, but also I don't think that it means that we've solved everything about AI, right? If you see what I mean.
It's only 2,500 words as well. So if you either got 2,500 words of this is how we solved it, or this is the problems we still had when it looked solved.
Also, Stephen said no space opera, so we had to
Yep.
train them.
Yeah, really hard. But I would say the same. I don't think that in the longevity ones they were all assuming that everything was solved. There were two things that really, they might have solved the kind of, they might have theoretically solved it. So in other words, there was a potential solution that would give somebody, a longevity or amazing cure from their disease or whatever. But there was always a kind of a drawback, which was where the identity theme came in. And there was this whole sort of idea that came in some of the stories, which was if you change every bit of the car, is the car still the same car? That kind of argument. And so that's where was the identity fully there still? And in fact, was maybe the actual identity of somebody sort of meshed up with the complexity of their mortality and their development over time? And the second thing was that then the one where it was all solved and the guy basically took a vaccine and lived forever until he was going to drop off his perch. That was really interesting because the writer had kind of explored, what's the new horizon. And the new horizon for healthcare completely changed because it's like, well, you've solved everything. So then it became sort of tech modifications of yourself, and sort of like this kind of fashion element. But actually things like fractures and accidents ended up becoming part of the sort of real second-class hospitals because they were kind of boring and also not where the medical tech interface wanted to be. And I thought that was an interesting take on our modern sort of, interest in sort of, modifications. Anyway, so the writer did think about the new horizons. I'm not sure I have yet got there.
I think
Thank you.
I'm just reflecting on the story that I wrote in the learning thing, which isn't that, in terms of technology, isn't that far out. But the thing that I wanted to play around with was how long would it take for this to be accepted as kind of normal. So this is where you can use a debating AI in an exam. Like how long is it going to take? How long did it take from calculators being invented to being allowed in exams? So I wanted to kind of play around with that time horizon in that, as well as other things in that story.
Yeah, and that is, these are the things we need to be thinking about now because that future is...
And we already are. Can you have a grant application that's written by ChatGPT? Can you, what...
Only if you're applying for a grant somebody's already got once before.
We'll take your last question here.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to read the book. I have so many questions, so it takes a moment to decide which question I'm going to ask. And I guess my question is kind of actually right to the comment, Christina, you made in the beginning of the talk about because I'm very much into the participatory foresight and kind of how people are thinking about a long-term future. And I think one problem we're often facing is for general public, we're kind of being occupied with this hype. Now it's AI. A few years ago, it's crypto, or then before that, it's metaverse. But as you guys said earlier, it's for those technologies, it's actually been developed 10, 20 years. I think this project like this kind of is really great in terms of getting people to maybe not technically in the lab to kind of have a conversation with the scientists who are actually developing those blue sky technologies. So I'm just kind of thinking maybe beyond the format of a book, because obviously if you want a book, it's very intensive for editors, but do you think maybe some sort of fan fiction or a blog to kind of engage public, especially youth or the marginalized group, to help them to think about, oh, this is might become some big thing in the next 10 or 20 years?
I mean, that's, I would say probably it's just social media as well, I suppose. But
if anybody wants to do a film or play,
we haven't so much explored Okay, to be fair, when we started with Stephen, and still very much at this point of the Cybersalon project was a different kind of scope, but especially when the projects are coming from me within academia, one of the reasons we went for short stories being read in public is that you can do it with a budget of near zero. Whereas when you start, blog, okay, but when you start thinking, oh, it would be great, some people have been asking me, oh, why aren't you doing animes or films or virtual reality or games? Like, well, budgets are not the same, So, yes, and okay, one of the things I like about, this wasn't so much meant to be read in public because the stories are much longer. But in other projects we have done before, the capacity of interact around the read in public story for me is really great.
Yeah.
Because it's not like throwing it, you publish something or as a blog or as a story, it goes on internet, it goes in a book. And it was part of the interviews I made for the previous book, actually, when I interviewed all the authors on why they wanted to participate in a project like this, where they put themselves on the spot, reading stories in public and so on. And the question, one of the answers was really nice. It's like, yeah, when I write a story that in a normal way, then I release it into an ocean of noise, and I leave it to fend for itself and find its audience. But when you are working around foresighting, doing some foresight work for a not too distant future, if the story finds their readers in 3 or 4 or 10 years' time, the window is past, really. So it's also about organizing it in ways that interact with the public at the moment when you need to interact with the public. The more complex aspect is how to draw the most difficult to reach publics that are not, is much more difficult to reach out to, and that's a general question about engaging with publics as scientists and so on. Is always like, it's always, there are the easy people to reach out to, and that's always the ones we get, but how to start thinking about reaching out to people we always have a hard time to reach out to. So we have been trying different formats, but it's a work in progress. It's action research, really.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop there. Thank you, and we can. And so there are a few copies of hard copies for sale, and which you can grab the authors and have them signed, actually.
Yeah,
well, they are still around. And we can hang around. I think we can hang around for a bit.
There's some drinks.
Okay, there are. Oh, wow. Great.